Welcome to the MED event, Looking Southward, the EU Quest for Energy Diversification. This initiative is organized in the framework of the 8th edition of the Rome MED Dialogues, a conference which will be held in Rome on 1-3 December, but we hold these kind of events throughout the year. We like to call it a year-long initiative. I am Matteo Villa. I head the data lab at here ESP. I'm a senior research fellow here. I'm glad to be able to introduce to you the guests for today's session. So joining me today, we have Ali Al-Safar, program manager at the Middle East and North Africa, for Middle East and North Africa at the International Energy Agency in Paris. Hello, Ali. And hello also to Duygu Sever-Mehmetoglu, postdoctoral researcher at the Hamad bin Khalifa University of the Qatar Foundation. Thank you for joining us. And hello also to Hern Yang, director of the program on economics and energy of the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. So just as a starter, now it's now 3 p.m. on this 8th of March 2022, and we have our oil price, the Brent price, is at around $127 per barrel, and the actually maybe even more consequential, the spot price of European natural gas in Europe is now hovering at around, I guess, 210 euros per megawatt hour. Just to give you a sense of what does this mean. In the first semester of 2021, so about a year ago, we were at around 20 euros, so 10 times the price that we've seen last year. And that's why we try to, I think this is an important event coming at the right time. Right on the heels of this, I guess in a few hours, the European Commission is going to present its strategy, its 10-point plan to diversify out of Russian gas. That's going, that promises to be a far-reaching plan, but also, far-reaching ambitions. The EU has already said that it is planning to, at least propose to cut 2/3 of Russian gas supplies in upcoming years with its own proposal. But we'll see whether we can get there and how to get there with such high prices. Once we know that just a small cut in Russian gas right now produces this kind of, huge event. And clearly the invasion also amplifies this kind of event. So thank you for joining us today, and thank you for being here to discuss these momentous events. Maybe my first question, and let me start with Ali Al-Safar. And my question to him is, what is the impact of the war in Ukraine on gas markets? And in particular, on the European gas market, and in turn, what impact do you expect this to have on the EU's energy transition? Ali, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Matteo, and hello, everybody. It's great to be with you today. To give some sort of a response to your answer, it's probably important to understand just what role Russian gas has to play in the European markets at the moment. We're talking at about 40% or so of European demand. That's Europe plus the UK, to be specific. Of that demand is met by imports from Russia, something amounting to around 155 billion cubic meters per year. Right now, there doesn't seem to be a physical disruption in flows, but there are, of course, extremely high prices. But what we are finding is that there's some volatility because of the fact that, of course, in Europe we've got our storage levels starting to get into quite critical zones. Typically this time of the year, we would have something like 42% of storage capacity filled. Right now, we're more around the 30% mark, and by the end of the month, it could be lower than that. So, of course, that's the first order of kind of uncertainty. But thinking about longer term, thinking about what the European response is, what the global response is to this kind of gas market shock induced by this war, it's effectively looking at some supply side reactions and some demand side reactions. On the supply side, what are Europe's options to basically diversify in quick order from their reliance on Russian gas? One area of flexibility potentially could be that Europe has quite high levels of unused LNG import capacity, somewhere in the region of 60 BCM. Now, of course, I have to caveat that by saying it's not necessarily the import capacity that's going to be the limiting factor, but rather the fact that there's not that much gas available on the spot market from outside of Russia, effectively. But there could be volumes made available, and in fact, we have been seeing that already. Since October or so, we've seen a quite significant increase in LNG imports into Europe, something like 2/3 increase. Half of that increase has come from the United States. Now, of course, there are seasonal elements that we need to take into consideration. These volumes are not going to be able to be made in perpetuity. Simply, we've had a slightly unseasonably warm season, and that was allowed to happen. Without that increase in LNG, we would be seeing storage levels much lower than we have even today. So we're looking effectively, LNG is potentially one thing that can be done on the supply side. Pipeline gas from places like Azerbaijan, from Algeria are another potential. Norway could potentially slightly boost some supply as well. On the demand side, the consumption in Europe is something that we're looking at quite closely in the IEA. We released last week a 10-point plan to reduce dependence on oil gas by a more moderate third in this coming year. And on the demand side, one of the simple things that can be done is basically limit thermostat. 1 degree Celsius decrease in thermostat readings in Europe will translate to around a 10 billion cubic meter reduction in gas use. So that's simple, demand side issues that can help remedy some of that situation. Another thing is, a revisiting of current policies in Europe, things like the decommissioning of nuclear power plants. Where this is safe, we've got four reactors that are supposed to be decommissioned this year, 1 reactor that's supposed to be decommissioned next year. If there's a delay in this decommissioning, if there's a safe delay and a safe management of that, then we're looking potentially at a saving of 1 BCM per year. So not insignificant amounts of gas. So these are the kinds of policies that we've been talking to policymakers about in trying to alleviate some of this reliance on that imported gas. Now, for the second part of your question, Matteo, and whether this will, what effect this will have on the energy transitions, I firmly believe that this will really sharpen the focus for an acceleration in the energy transition. I think what this does is when people used to think of the energy trifecta as being kind of these elements in tension, where on the one hand you have energy security, on the other hand you have energy transitions and sustainability, I think the energy transitions is now very much being viewed as being something that can be complementary to energy security. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if we see a renewed focus on renewables, on demand side, on energy efficiency as a way of basically amplifying energy security in the continent.
Thank you, Ali. Absolutely. I guess that one of the, as you said, there is a possibility, and most likely that this will increase the attempts to transition more swiftly towards other non-gas solutions. And one of these, which has in a sense surprised no one, but it's interesting to see, is maybe even the role of coal, which is at least let's say taken into account and taken into consideration by those countries that are most reliant right now on natural gas and maybe do not have much alternatives. So I'm not talking about France, which has nuclear, but I'm talking about Italy, so my country, the country in which I'm in. Maybe I'll get back to you in a few minutes also on this, which is one of the most interesting parts, maybe to distinguish the very short term with the midterm, which you were talking about. So moving, thank you, to Duygu Severmemetolu, and specifically asking her, given that she's on the Qatar Foundation, much has been said about Qatar's potential role in alleviating the current energy crunch in the EU. On the other hand, as Ali was saying, about half of what LNG more additional energy has been provided to Europe has come from the United States, not from Qatar. So about 1 in 6 more energy has come from Qatar. What do you think? Is this true that Qatar may provide an alternative in the short to mid-term? And so what's your take on this?
Thank you, Matteo. Hello, everyone. Glad to be here today with you. And actually, this is a very timely question. And even before the crisis escalated, Qatar and United States had a meeting regarding a potential role for Qatar's, LNG to come in case there's a disruption of supplies coming from Russia to the European Union. And now Qatar is, of course, under the spotlight as a key player in the gas market. And this is no surprise because Qatar has the third largest natural gas reserves after Russia and Iran. It has a reserves for almost 13% of the world reserves. And it has a share in the overall LNG exports in the world with a 21%, just second after the Australian share. And regarding the implication of all of these potential in the EU's sphere, so almost 40% of European Union's imports are coming from Russia, as opposed to only 5% coming from Qatar. One of the main reasons for this was that Qatar had been looking for predictable customers through long-term LNG contracts. And on the other side, the European Union had been more resistant towards 10-year, 15-year, 20 years of contracts, unlike other Asian customers for Qatar. And this resulted in a huge share of Asia-Pacific markets in Qatar's LNG exports. So for now, almost 68% of Qatar's LNG goes to Asia. And the market Qatar's LNG exports are dominated by India, South Korea, Japan, China, of course. And very recently, for instance, last year, there has been new agreements coming up for further 10 years, for 20 years, starting as of 2024 or 2025. And this emphasis of long-term contracts, predictable customers, has been on the agenda for a while for Qatar. And even in the recent gas exporting countries summit forum that took place in Doha, Qatar and other exporter countries has been highlighting this dimension. So the idea is that there is a significant need for further investment in order to expand the gas infrastructure, to increase the volume. But on the other hand, in order to meet this investment, the need for certainty can come with long-term agreements in order to guarantee the supplies to Europe. But on the other hand, this has a downside as well for today's purposes. The long-term contracts that Qatar has now kind of almost blocks its LNG exports, and it limits its flexibility regarding short-term on-spot sales. And for example, till now, only 10 to 13% of Qatar's LNG was on the spot market for short-term. This means that Qatar has little LNG for now to divert to Europe to replace Russian gas supplies in case of a disruption. And this was also articulated by the state officials as well. Recently, Qatar's energy minister, Saad Al-Kaabi, stated that not only Qatar, but also none of the other countries on its own can replace Russian gas volumes to Europe, right? So this is a huge amount. As a whole, for the short term, most of the Qatar supplies are and will be diverted to Asian buyers for now. But the amount that can be directed to Europe ranges between 10 to 15%. This is for the short term, though. In the midterm and long term, Qatar has been planning expansions, especially for its North Field expansion project. It has some strict targets for the year 2025 and 2027, so two-layer expansion, and it aims to increase its LNG production yearly to 126 million by 2027. And of course, this increased volume needs new supply contracts. So we come back to the original dimension. In order these supplies to be again sent to Europe, there are some terms of references that Qatar and the EU has to agree on, especially in the realm that Qatar is asking the European Union to restrict the resale of the gas to other buyers outside the European continent. So this is something that they need to sit down and consider. So in the midterm and long term, Qatar will have to balance its export strategy between the gas-hungry Asia, which has been already Qatar's, main target, and with the European markets, which are looking for diversification. And as a final note, maybe I think an important thing in all of this, like what can be the reflection of this into Qatar's own development and Qatar's own energy transition, I think this is a critical point to highlight as well, which can be also relevant for other gas exporting countries in the MENA region. Qatar's total energy supply portfolio is dominated by natural gas itself, and its electricity generation is also totally produced by natural gas, right? But on the other hand, just like many countries, it has its own targets regarding decarbonization, energy transition. For instance, renewables should be like 20% by 2030. There's a targeting for reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 25%, again by 2030. And if you look at Qatar's national vision, for instance, you would see that economic diversification is a recurring and important theme. Qatar knows that although natural gas is an important factor in its economy right now, it will have to diversify its economy so that its country can be successful in the post-carbon world, right? So this can be including like knowledge-based society, education, health, innovation, or entrepreneurship. And the important thing is that this is also acknowledged by important stakeholders in Qatar, such as Qatargas. So Qatargas identifies that sustainability is one of the major challenges in the oil and gas sector, and it can be further implications for the overall energy transition, both for the region and in the globe, right? To this end, there are some efforts to decrease the carbon intensity of LNG production chains by Qatargas, or other strategies to mitigate or minimize the environmental damage. There are some programs to foresee or control methane leaks or control the carbon footprint of the overall LNG production process. This is an important thing to keep in mind, but the challenge would remain for Qatar, especially if it targets to expand its production and exports to Europe or other emerging markets, because it will be a decision on balancing its own sustainability and decarbonization with its dominance in the natural gas markets, right? So the role that Qatar will be assigning to natural gas in its economy and its national vision will be highly influencing its own investments as well. And it can also be a risk maybe for technology lock-ins, since natural gas is considered as a transition source, eventually leading up to the zero carbon world, to compensate, to help renewables to take over. I think this will be a tricky decision for Qatar in its overall energy strategy.
Thank you, Duygu. Absolutely clear. And possibly one take-home comment that I get. Actually, I get back to you then in the second round of questions, more precisely on this, but maybe one take-home point is that the EU sometimes wants to have its cake and eat it, which is we want flexibility in our own supplies, but we usually do not pay that much attention on the fact that according to our competition policy, liberalization policies, we want everything to be on the spot market. But this, on the one hand, has allowed, for instance, Russia to reduce supplies by 20% without incurring any penalties, and on the other hand, clearly we cannot really, for instance, groom some other suppliers without promising to take up that additional gas in the future. So that's an important take-home point that we still continue to have to look into in Europe, given the current crisis and what it means for the future. But now moving to Karen Young, maybe again a recurrent theme is that again Qatar has provided some additional gas, but not that much, and most of the LNG has come, for instance, from the United States and not from MENA countries, so Middle East and Northern African countries, not in the form of pipeline gas and not in the form of LNG gas, not that much at least. So it is astounding to me if I think of this crisis occurring, for instance, 10 years ago. Clearly this couldn't have happened for the simple fact that the US was still not an energy exporter then, at least for natural gas. And so my question to you is, can you explain to us what happened, why has it been so, and whether, in your opinion, MENA countries can come to Europe's aid in the future? So the floor is yours, Karen.
Thank you, Matteo. It's good to be with you, and thank you for the invitation. You're right. This is an incredible story of the rise of U.S. LNG, and something that we didn't even think about even just a couple of years ago, being in this capacity for export to Europe. I think it's a truly market-driven destination of exports. That's really, just the prices are generating the movement and the directionality of these exports. In 2020, 13% of US LNG went to South Korea, 12% to Japan, 9% to China. That was the market. And there is room to grow. Non-US liquefaction utilization is still 75 to 85%. So that means that there's, maybe as much as 25% of capacity to, increase some of those exports abroad. But in the US, this also depends on an infrastructure challenge, and that's in process. There are new LNG facilities coming online in Louisiana and Texas, where most US terminals are, but it's not a quick fix, right? And the destination of US LNG exports can shift very quickly, as we saw in 2021 and 2022. But the gas business in the United States is really not a political priority. Even in this crisis we're in right now, the Biden administration is not necessarily offering a lot of incentives or government support to amplify this. And just like many other countries in the Middle East, the priority is also going to be on domestic electricity generation, domestic demand. Between European countries and the United States, or the EU and the US, I think Europe has developed as a beneficiary or as a destination of US LNG over time. There were almost no receivable LNG exports in 2016 to the EU. It was 23% of US exports by 2021. And then just in the first few months of this year, in January, the EU received 37% of total US exports, which is just incredible, this shift. And as has been mentioned, the spot market is getting more active. And because Europe has been willing to pay higher prices, we're seeing this kind of shift in directionality of cargoes and where they're headed. And so even among producers, we're seeing really rising domestic demand for natural gas and LNG. And this will be, I think, a constraint going forward, especially from the Middle East, in Egypt, in Israel, and in Algeria. So who exports the most? How could we increase more supply to Europe? I think we have to consider the infrastructure, pipelines versus LNG, and how to receive it. So, first, pipelines from North Africa include the Medgas, which runs from Algeria to Spain, the Transmed, which runs from Algeria through Tunisia to Italy. And that's really the largest export capacity from the MENA region to Europe. Also problematic, of course, is the Maghreb-Europe gas line, which is, disputed now in contractual terms between Morocco and Algeria. So that is not exporting at the moment. The general consensus on boosting Algerian exports to Europe is that, there is really not a lot in terms of supply, not much in terms of new investment interest that could change these kind of three vehicles or avenues of export. We saw in 2020 a real decline in capex across the oil and gas industries, and that has not yet recovered. And so I think the open question is, with the kind of energy transition, with this energy crisis that we're in, how will markets respond, and will there be renewed interest from international oil companies, energy companies into the sector? And in certain places in the Middle East, will they be the first choices? And I think Algeria really is emblematic of that challenge. Investors have been moving more into the kind of ESG nominated financial products. And so it will be hard to do, like there's a new proposal to build a pipeline from Nigeria through Niger into Algeria and then to Europe. That's really a lot of money, which investors are not necessarily coming to the table right now. Furthermore, it doesn't happen quickly, right? This is not necessarily a solution to our current problem. In the Eastern Med, some interesting things going on, new investments in the Leviathan and the Tamar field. We saw a $1 billion investment from Mubadala, the UAE Sovereign Wealth Fund. And Egypt is, of course, trying to really build its place as an LNG exporter and investing in new facilities, new terminals. But the demand for domestic production is really, I think, will be a constraint. Egypt has had some sort of back and forth, pulling back on production over time. And as Dugu said, the first concern for developing economies is to have a contract in place that guarantees a certain amount of revenue, which helps them plan and helps them pay for the enormous expense of building this infrastructure. And so I think for Egypt, that is going to be an important consideration. Let me say a quick word about European gas imports and real variation in dependency on Russian gas. So I think, in the context, it's important to think about where the infrastructure is, and then, sort of who are or the most exposed, of course, to Russian volatility. So for Spain, the UK, Ireland, Portugal, this is not a Russian pipeline gas destination. These are not. So they're more reliant on Norway, on LNG. And so it's interesting to think about within a European context, how you would create more exchange in between. What are the kind of infrastructure facilities to do that? And that really becomes an EU policy challenge. There are a lot of new LNG transport carriers, these huge ships that are being put into the market, which have been built and now ready to travel and to export. So that is not really one of our constraints in LNG markets right now. That's doing quite well, but you have to have the terminals to receive them, and then from the terminals you have to have the transfer to power plants. And so these are problems that are years to solve. And as I think Ali mentioned, the kind of immediate concern in Europe is about storage. And there's not really much that Middle East suppliers or even US exporters can do about that. We could consider some floating storage, but, the capacity and the price at which you would have to buy right now to think about the winter of 2022 and early 23 becomes very, very challenging in Europe.
Thank you, Karen. Absolutely clear and precise. I mean, you show that Europe, in the end, right now, doesn't have that many alternatives that can come up online, and so no easy solutions to the current crisis. And I guess so now coming back to Ali with this. What alternatives, maybe not in terms of gas, but of other sources, does the EU have? So is there nuclear, or again, firing up more coal? A solution to this problem, at least in the short term, and how is this going to affect the transition, maybe again in the short term? And the second thing is these high energy prices, especially natural gas prices to our neighbors, and then oil prices in general to the world. Do they risk, in your opinion, to derail maybe or slow down the energy transition from other places outside the EU for our partners? What's your take on this?
Thanks, Matteo. So on your first question, I think it's clear that one of the options on the power sector side is to revisit this moratorium on nuclear. Not even the moratorium, the actual shutdown of nuclear plants. I think there's quite significant volumes that can be saved just by making sure that continues, or that those power plants continue. I think. As outlined expertly by both previous speakers, by Duyu and Karen, there isn't a huge amount of additional supply that can be brought on to alleviate the dependence on Russian gas. And so essentially, we're just going to have to make savings everywhere and make sure that any additional supply that can be brought on is brought on. This is effectively what will happen. I think with regards to kind of what many Europeans would be considering unsavory forms of electricity power generation, increased reliance on coal, etc. Now, of course, Europe has very clear climate ambitions and goals, and it's been world leading when it comes to advocating for this. I think in the end, it's going to be a tension between the short term and the medium and long term, and just to make sure that what happens in the short term doesn't completely derail the medium and longer term aspirations. In a time of this kind of extreme circumstance at the moment, I think countries will do what they can to make sure that they can keep the lights on, and I don't know if that's unreasonable, whether that's in Europe or elsewhere. With regards to your second question, this is a really, really interesting question, and I want to kind of link it to something that you mentioned when it comes to not only energy transitions but economic transformations. I'm joined here by real experts on these issues, and you mentioned, for example, that it's part of the national vision of Qatar. But if you looked at the national visions or they're called the national development plans of Saudi Arabia, going back to 1970, they've also kind of highlighted this issue of economic diversification as being a matter of priority. So for 52 years, this has been highlighted as a matter of priority, and not much progress has been made. And the reason I bring this up is because, like the economic diversification, energy transitions, the focus might be sharpened at times when oil prices are low, and there's this kind of push to change. When oil prices are high, the incentive to change is sometimes muted a little bit more. And so it's that cyclicality that can be quite damaging. But I think with regards to the actual net effect on countries in the region, it really depends on the country and the circumstance. For oil exporters, for the large oil exporters that have transition plans, that maybe have net zero ambitions or have visions that include a large rollout of renewables, this kind of payday could enable that. The windfalls from this extra oil revenue could enable a move towards making these plans actually a reality. That's the optimistic take. The alternative is obviously, the places are awash in money, and the focus on the need to change starts to blur a little bit more. Now, not every country in the region is an exporter. In fact, there are quite significant importers. There are countries that don't have oil and gas revenues that they can fall back on. And for countries like that, they're impacted by this war in much different ways. So if you're looking at countries like Jordan, parts of the Levant, etc., that don't have any meaningful energy exports, rely on energy imports, and also rely on imports for food, we're looking at a situation where there's inflationary pressure, probably a focus on trying to mitigate the effects of that, and therefore remove the focus a little bit away from the energy transitions. This is kind of the pessimistic take. If I'm going to be highlighting two countries that have been somewhat, at least regionally, considered quite loud voices, vociferous voices for energy transitions, you look at Morocco, you look at Jordan. These guys have had quite progressive stances when it comes to the energy transitions. But in a world where grain prices are going through the roof and governments start to worry about food inflation, can they maintain focus on all of these areas simultaneously? That's the one thing that I would call into question. But it could work in both directions. What the EU could do about it is basically, if it turns out that the longer term strategy, by no means the immediate strategy, but the longer term strategy towards diversification away from natural gas imports is kind of this increased focus on low carbon hydrogen, for example, then there are countries in the region now that are getting quite a good windfall from the oil price and oil revenues who've identified high-tech, new or low carbon technologies as potentially being areas of future industrialization. Maybe this could give it a boost. If they're now awash in capital that wasn't available before, then we might see a renewed impetus on things like low carbon hydrogen in countries that would make sense for them to pursue that.
Thank you, Ali. So let me maybe again pose the same question to someone who is there actually in an oil and gas exporter, clearly. So that side of the equation. And while you were speaking, I was thinking out loud. I was thinking that there is also true the fact that it's not just energy inflation, right? It's energy prices, but also many other things that the same country who is an oil exporter and gas exporter has to import right now, right? Especially Qatar, we know it is very much dependent on imports for many, commodities and even food. And I'm not going to ask you, Hugo, about political stability. Clearly, we know that. Just in passing, just in mention, I allow myself to do this as I'm a political analyst. I remember the source of the 2011 Arab Springs, let's call it like that, or anyway, the protests in the MENA regions, which were very much not oil exporters, energy exporters, but energy importers. But again, the food prices, not just the energy prices, shock was moving and rattling the region. My question to you is, what do you think about both the energy transition, as you mentioned beforehand? Qatar has set itself some plans. Do you think that that might slow down given the high energy prices? And what about the rest of the sustainability of the system at a time of high inflation and high prices, which are not limited to the energy sector?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for this question. Actually, the response to this is very challenging. First of all, I totally agree with Ali, who recently stated that there's a trade-off between short-term solutions and longer-term energy targets or energy strategies, right? In the short term, whenever traditional challenges to security come into the picture, you have to come up with easy cuts, easy solutions, and these can be sometimes incompatible with climate solutions or energy transition strategies. This is the pessimistic and the ugly truth part of the challenges of today. And regarding the spillover impacts of other issues, for the sake of Qatar, Qatar had been going through an isolation process prior to a couple of years, and it has been already acknowledged that it has to be, diversifying its resources in terms of food. It has to be, self-sufficient almost. To what extent it can be possible in today's world is questionable. But in that regard, Qatar, for the sake of Qatar, I can say it's very aware of its challenges, and it's kind of trying to modify its system in the best possible way regarding the sustainable solutions, and it's trying to target its own vulnerabilities. And I think its position regarding its diplomatic position, like trying to solve everything through diplomatic means, trying to have friendly relations with international actors, is part of the strategy in order to navigate in the global arena. But as a whole, if we think of the MENA region and how all of these can affect the countries in MENA region as a whole, not Qatar per se, I think the situation gets even further tricky because there are some characteristics specific to MENA region, and the region is huge, and the countries in here are subject to similar challenges. As a whole, MENA region is actually identified as one of the most vulnerable regions to the effects of climate change, right? And this is very important. So they share some similar problems regarding drier or warmer seasons, like water security, how all of these will be reflected to water scarcity, availability of resources, food security, whether there will be some climate-induced migration, for instance, and the region is already turbulent, and the impacts of all of this will be critical. Detecting these problems is very critical. Hence, energy transition and decarbonization, tackling these issues in the global or regional level, are very vital. But on the other hand, if you look at the profiles of the countries, they are very different at the same time. So they have different political situations, they have different economic opportunities, their demographics are different. And in the field of energy, even there are some importers and exporters, and we cannot expect importers and energy exporters to be affected by these overall dynamics in the global level at the same level. So regarding how this can spill over into the region, on the positive side, I think that for the renewables, for energy efficiency measures or technologies which are compatible with energy transition, there can be an acceleration which can potentially spill over to the region, so long as the investments can allow it. If there is a direction towards coal in Europe, I think this would have a really negative effect in terms of incentives from the developing countries in MENA regarding to diversifying their own economies with alternative low carbon resources as opposed to coal, for instance. But the most critical thing of all of this will be EU's efforts to diversify its suppliers in the global perspective, because it would create, for the importers in MENA, it would create kind of a competition to secure their own uninterrupted supplies at affordable, reasonable prices, right? And on the other hand, for exporters, going back to the investment and everything, the challenges between short-term and long-term, it will, of course, create some opportunities for like new markets maybe or new buyers. But on the other hand, it will also come with a price regarding extended investments for the extraction, transmission networks, transportation of the gas, of the resources. And again, these investments will be risking the creation of some liabilities for the energy transition for energy exporting countries. And natural gas, acknowledged as a transition, a bridge technology, can be remaining as the core of the economy, and can take away maybe from the potential investments for renewables or energy efficiency or whatever measures are required for energy transition, and therefore can delay the low carbon transition in the MENA region. And last but not least, I think it's also right to emphasize that traditionally, oil and gas has been at the core of conflicts, right? If you look at the literature, I also come from a political science and international relations background. If you look at the literature, you would see that either as the core, the reason of the conflict, or as a tool of the conflict, natural resources has been militarized by many countries. And this can also further deepen already existing turbulences and vulnerabilities in the region as well. So one thing is, this increasing effort coming from Europe might be triggering the actors in here in a positive way and also in a negative way. So it will be very critical to see whether it will create not maybe political conflict, but dispute at least in the MENA region or in the Eastern Mediterranean, let's say, regarding it will be critical to foresee whether it will ignite conflict or lead to cooperation, which will again have further spillover effect, going back to the energy transition discussion. So I think it's kind of a vicious circle as well, unfortunately.
So vicious circle or virtual circle, we'll see clearly, but surely our eyes must be peeled not just on the EU side of the equation and energy security, but on the spillover effects. And as you say, Hugo, this is absolutely what we want to do, and tracking as well, during our let's say, journey towards the Rome conference. I hope there will be more opportunities also to track what has been going on over the months as these high oil and energy and gas prices, so hydrocarbon prices, remain with us. So thanks a lot. Let me move to a different question for Karen, which is, so we've seen the possible effects on the region, the fact that we have, let's say, few resources to go about, and yet there is talk about, sanctioning oil and gas exports from Russia. So even more decreasing, even more both flows, or both for the global markets and for the EU energy markets. And so my question to you is, do you think this is feasible or good to explore, and what kind of efforts does this entail for other countries that should come on board? And maybe also, do you fear that this pressure towards sanctioning the oil and gas industry and fields and exports in Russia could maybe backfire on the unity between the EU and the US, given that the US is a bit less exposed on oil and much less exposed on Russian gas? Karen, to you.
Well, you're exactly right. I mean, the the potential impact into the U.S. Is much, much less than what we would see if there were European sanctions on Russian oil and gas exports. But the fact is, it's already happening, right? And it's happening from a market perspective, and a transaction standpoint. Buyers are hesitant to engage with Russian firms, so we're seeing a lot of Russian missing barrels of oil that are not getting to market, and so that already puts pressure on this diminished supply. The U.S. and the Biden administration is probably going to announce today sanctions on Russian oil and gas. There's basically no Russian gas that goes to the U.S., very little Russian oil that comes to the U.S. And so it's really more of a political statement. There's pressure from U.S. Congress to make this an issue. And I think there's a little bit of a risk as it creates a bit of distance or daylight between what has been a very cohesive sanctions policy between the European Union and our partners in Great Britain and the United States against Russia. So I think that is something to think about. For Europe and coordinating with Europe, this would be devastating in terms of economic impact and already expected rise in inflation and a GDP shock. So Europeans will certainly not want to move ahead with that if the U.S. does. The U.S. impact of sanctioning or embargoing Russian oil would be probably 0.33% of a negative GDP growth hit. So, pretty minor compared to the, kind of systemic risk that we are looking at right now in terms of global contagion and inflation pressure. But, oil is a global market, and this disruption is going to hit in many, many other ways. Food prices is one example, but it's going to be in the petrochemicals and the kinds of materials that we see in many of our manufacturing processes. So there's more at stake than just energy prices. I'll give you an example. Goldman Sachs estimates that if Russian shipments of gas through Ukraine are stopped, the euro area could see a 1% hit to GDP for gas alone, with Germany and Italy most affected. And if Russia halts gas exports entirely, the EU could see a 2.2% decline in GDP for the year. So, that sounds like, oh, that's not a big number. That's a very, very big number. We're coming out of the pandemic. We're fighting for every little inch of GDP growth that we can get. And we're facing a situation where we are looking at perhaps global recession. So I think I understand why in the United States this has become a politically popular measure. And I hope that our European partners will see it in that context, that this is about U.S. domestic politics and not an effort to create distance between our concerted effort at confronting Russian aggression in Ukraine.
Thanks a lot, Karen. Very clear. And now we have around 10 minutes, and we were already opening the floor to questions, so we collected some. And I guess there are two of them that I would like to pose, both to you, Karen, and Ali. So back to Ali now, and then one different question to Hugo. But this is pretty much, on the heels of what you were just saying. I think it's a very important and opportune question. It shifts us away from the gas market. Looking at oil right now, the question is this: oil prices have rallied to the highest level in over 7 years this week, and the OPEC Plus has resisted calls to increase output. How can we explain the position of producing countries? This is a question, maybe just let me put it into context for you, Ali, first. We know that the International Energy Agency has decided to release a first batch of 60 million barrels to the market in order to maybe calm it down from its strategic reserve. And if I'm not wrong, there was floating some other options to release more barrels over these days. So what do you think about the decision of the OPEC Plus? How do you maybe explain it, and how do you take it, and what kind of policy do the IEA countries, so energy dependent but energy importers that have a strategic reserve, maybe going to make if the OPEC Plus position remains this?
Thank you, Matteo, and thank you for the question from the audience. I'm not going to speculate on what OPEC Plus may or may do, or in fact what our member countries decide to do. We're a secretariat, we give advice, but at the same time, we are also beholden to to the decisions of our member countries, and they decide what they see as being fit given the market conditions. But in general, I mean, what the way we're interpreting the market is that there is now what is considered a very tight market condition. Prices are maybe, I think we can all agree, are unreasonably high. I'm not even sure producers think that this is a sustainable level. So producers always look at the long term. They behave quite wisely when looking at the long term, because they don't want demand destruction either that could risk their future markets. But for us, it's very much a matter of whether this is the fundamentals, and we see the fundamentals as being extremely tight, and so we would welcome, of course, additional supplies onto the market. Now, of course, again, and as was alluded to by Karen earlier, we come into this crisis having just barely emerged from the previous one, and the previous one had different pressures to this, in the sense that we had extremely low oil prices in 2020, complete disincentive to invest in current supply, etc. So we are emerging into a new crisis almost with very few tools to be able to address it. But every little helps at the moment, and I think everybody agrees that this is quite an unsustainable period that adds to additional inflationary pressure at a time where most of the world cannot really afford it.
Thank you, Ali. Thank you for sticking to the time. And sorry if I, a bit pricked you on this, let's say, politically sensitive question, but clearly, your analysis makes it clear that we are living in a tight market, and maybe even producers might be interested in acting. Let's see whether this is the case. So maybe, again, back to Karen, the same question. If you want to give us also some political side to this question, but also some technical side, clearly, what's your take on the fact that OPEC Plus stick to its own targets despite these jumping prices? Do you think that they think it's temporary, or is there a strategy here? Or, what's your take?
Well, the agreement does call for an increase in production through this year. So we will see more supply come online. And I think the expectation is certainly a little bit of fear of, the demand destruction that we're going to create with prices reaching $130 a barrel. So that is some of the fear. But I will speculate a little bit. I do think that the UAE and Saudi Arabia are the ones who have spare capacity. They are most likely to be able to take some of the missing Russian market share. And they have an incentive to do so. And I think they're sort of waiting for the moment to do so. And I don't know if that's a price point or if that's a political negotiation, but I think that's, a likely scenario. It's some related to the potential reentry of Iran. And if we see 500,000 barrels a day of Iranian oil going to market, that will create a little bit of a cushion. So I think, maybe in the next week, we keep thinking it's 1 week, then it's 1 week more. We'll have some clarity on that. But that will probably influence OPEC Plus's next meeting and potential increase of production.
Thank you. I think now you pointed at some of the speculations, clearly, also political speculations that have been around. Clearly, let's say an Iran deal would have made the market a bit less tight, and clearly now there is some leverage for oil exporters to use also for some political gains. And for those who dial in, I encourage you to have a look at clearly the speculations that are making rounds about Saudi Arabia and the relationship with Washington, which is interesting. Maybe not the whole story here, but some of those are interesting to look into further. And so thank you, Karen. And now moving to Duygu, the question for you is again related to the sustainability of the current environment, possibly again on looking at both oil exporters and energy exporters, but also energy importers. What about, for instance, energy subsidies? So we know that during high energy prices, in the end, that's a lost profit, at least for the exporters, and it's clearly a problem for those who are importing and still are subsidizing their energy sector or other sector. So what impact do you expect maybe to see on fragile economies? Is there going to be additional social stress? And maybe, just let me add this, some other commenter was speculating about Qatar being pressured into accepting, let's say, more spot markets, given that the EU is asking, which has a lot of political weight. I'm not really convinced about this question. That's why I was leaving it as last. But what's your take on this? Do you think that the EU coming very hard on Doha could change this, convince Qatar to release more spot markets shipments? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. Of course, I'm not in a position to offer an official perspective, but as a comment, I think this is kind of a negotiation process, right? So Qatar would, of course, as an exporter, as an investor, would look for long-term guarantees to ensure that the gas that it produces or extracts has a customer. And especially this is very critical given today's world, although not now, although not in 20 years, but eventually we are talking about in like half of the century, we are talking about getting all fossil fuels out of the picture. And I even remember a report from International Energy Agency saying we should leave all the fossils in the ground if we want to reach our targets. There was a striking comment on that. So, of course, a natural gas state would look for guarantees to ensure that it will not be like left on in the middle when the time comes. So these 20-year, 15-year agreements ensure Qatar and other exporters a guarantee in that regards. And on the other hand, EU has its own reasons for asking for spot market and more flexibility, even for resale, for having this, flexible gas market within its context. I think it will be, again, an issue of negotiation. We will be hearing more about this issue in the near future, especially when the expansions of gas of Qatar's LNGs in the North Field are more about to come into being. Like in the upcoming years, I think when trying to secure the actual output, I think this will be an item on the table. But for now, as Qatar has already long-term agreements with Asia, and this is an important market for Qatar, I don't think that it would be pushed to agree on that because it already has its alternatives. And maybe in that regard, we can say even that it's the need for diversification from the other side. So I think it would be kind of almost the vice versa of it. Like Qatar would be in a more advantageous position compared to its negotiations with the European Union. But it will be interesting to see what the future holds for that regard.
Okay. Maybe you wanted to comment. I'll give you 1 minute and then I'll have to close, but maybe on the sustainability of energy subsidies in the region, also for oil-dependent countries, but maybe also for Qatar.
For the subsidies, so I don't come from a price background, economic, but I think the subsidies and the way the governments are tackling them is very important for the course of energy transition. So are they staying in the economy or are they being, taken away from the picture? I think it will be very important regarding how the renewables alternatives will be coming into picture, especially for countries where the energy portfolios are dominated by gas and oil. But it will be up to national governments to tackle it in specific country context.
Thank you so much. Yeah, very brief and very, very precise on this. So thanks a lot to everyone. I guess that maybe the take-home message is when you look for alternatives and you do so in tight markets, but maybe do not expect to hold the largest, stick of the negotiation and do not expect to come back as a winner. And this is especially for those at home that said, well, we are so huge, such a huge market in the EU, so that everybody will have to buy to us. Well, no, that's not exactly how it's going to work. And surely in the next few months, we at ISPI, and I'm sure at IEA, at the Middle East Institute, at the Qatar Foundation, we will continue to monitor the situation. I hope that will be another occasion to see you over the next few months and to reassess and take stock of what happened. But for the meantime, I have to close this session. I learned a lot. I thank you all. So thank you, Duigo. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Ali, for this. And I hope to see you again. And so thank you. Thank you for our viewers, and see you next time.
Thank you.